Good morning, everyone. Almost afternoon now here on the official first day of Dare to Be Great 4 Era of the Headset. And this is one of three gold sponsor sessions that are going to be going on. And this one here, I am with Andrew Palmer, and he's the manager of learning design at the International Academies of Emergency Dispatch. And we'll be doing a session today called Trends in Training Technology, What's Right for Your Center. It is awesome to have you here, and a big thanks to the IAD for being a gold sponsor. And without further ado, take it away, sir.
All right. Thanks, Ricardo. Yeah, thanks y'all for being here. Just so you're aware, I'm definitely a big fan of trying to make this as interactive as possible. And I also, so I know that we're kind of limited to chat, but please use chat. I'll just continuously be monitored, just looking at chat the whole time. So yeah, please feel free to throw in questions, comments into chat. I'm going to be asking questions throughout. It'd be great if we could all just throw in some answers, because I'd really like this to be a little more of a discussion. But before I get started, a little bit background about myself. My name is Andrew Palmer. I am the manager of learning and design at the IAED. That means that I primarily work on my team. We make most of the college courses that are available on the College of Emergency Dispatch. Primarily, we build online training. And I've been trying I've been around in the academy prior to dispatch for about a combination about 5 years. And I have more of a background. I have a background in education. I was originally English school teacher and history teacher. Transitioned into more of the corporate, training environment, and somehow just wound up in this world of training dispatchers, which I've really, really grown to love. And one of the things I've been trying to do just in the last few years is trying to just bring in some fresh ideas that are just kind of in the broader training industry, and try to help people, get a little bit of a feel for what's coming from just the bigger training industry, and maybe some things that, I think will make sense and maybe make a big impact in the 911 training world, and maybe even emergency services more broadly. But I think it's maybe just worth exploring those things a little bit, because there are a lot of things coming, I think, down the pipe, and it's interesting, but I think there's also a bit of questions. Sometimes, I don't want to say snake oil, but there's definitely there definitely are like some really exciting things, and then some other things that I think people are talking a lot about but aren't as exciting. So I thought it would be valuable to go over those things. And a little bit at the end, I will talk a little bit about our courses on the college. We're trying to do some better things. We're always trying to get better. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I pasted in the chat up at the top a link to just a simple web page that has this presentation that I'll do today, just because I know people ask. You can download it there or just view it there. And then I also linked to a few different recent courses that we've released on the College of Emergency Dispatch. And I'll talk a little bit about more what those are at the very end. So yeah, what I really wanted to talk about today, the bigger piece, was really just trends in technology. What's going on, and what do I think is actually going to make sense for 911 training? So the first question I asked, and again, it'd be great. I'm glad that you all are using the chat a bit. Nice to see where everyone's from. But I was hoping that just paste right in the chat. But I'm just curious, what kind of, what people think. What kind of problems can training solve? What is training a good tool what is training a good tool for? And again, I don't mind too much awkward silences, but yeah, it'd be great to just paste in the chat if you have any ideas about what problems can training solve. And one of the reasons I ask is sometimes I think people try to solve problems with training that really aren't training problems. I have a whole theory about this. I've done some presentations for other dispatch training folks. And one of the things I like to bring up is a concept of just basically like, okay, the first flow and the first question when you're thinking about training should always be like, is this an actual training problem? Because I don't know about you, but as a person who develops training in different organizations, you often get people who show up and they say, we just need people to be aware of X. Because, and often what it often is like, we just need a training on this. We just need a training on this topic, this thing. And usually where that comes from is some pain point someone's experiencing down the line. But often when it gets brought back to the people, training developers, training supervisors, trainers in general, it is often brought in as like, well, we need just training on this. People need to be aware of this. But often it's not really back to where's that pain point? Why is this being brought up? Yeah, like Ricardo said, it can be creating a standard, but it could also be, and that consistency, that's definitely an important piece of it. But even how do you get those, even create those standards? Like, how do you get people to follow those standards? So I've came up with a couple here. Just there's general compliance, and this, I mean, as much as sometimes this frustrates me because I'm like, I've talked to the people who set some of the, state standards on what training should be happening for dispatchers, and often it's just a number, and a little bit frustrating to me because then it's like, well, what is that actually saying about? I mean, that could be drastically different. Someone can do some excellent, really quality training, and every one of those hours is, in-depth, hands-on practice with an expert. And then someone else might just be, just checking a box, just reading, reading some articles or something like that. So there can be really difference in that. But ultimately there is compliance. And I would say even the general, more broad training industry has actually been here for a long time. I don't know if anyone here, I don't know how each individual person in here tracks their training. It tends to be, I've talked to quite a few training supervisors and directors, and it's everywhere from people do it all in Excel sheets, or some people have some really fancy new modern learning management system platforms that track all of their training. It really runs the gamut. I think honestly, that's probably true of all training across the 911 industry, is that there's some real differences. One of the things I know when I listen to Within the Trenches, it's really interesting to hear. And I know Ricardo, actually, I really like this. He often is asking about, what does the training look like? What's that onboarding process? What was your first day look like? I remember I actually heard Ricardo talking about that his first was like them showing up at midnight saying, hey, you're starting tonight, and just throw you on the phone. Like, and then the trainer is just basically like, I'll just be over your shoulder, right? Yeah, it was very different. But it really is super interesting because, I mean, it can really run the gamut. But compliance, at some level, someone's got to be tracking something, so it makes sense. But the other thing I think that problems that training really can solve, and I think the much more difficult, challenging thing that we're trying to do with training is to actually address performance, not just check the box, but standardize things, get things written down. I mean, get things in a way that we're actually like, people do the things we want them to do. Not just that when they don't do the things we've told them to do, we can say, we told them to do it. That's what compliance is. But whereas this performance, I think, is where the real challenge lies. And then I ask the questions like, what's the most effective way to improve someone's performance? Be interested to hear if, anyone's thoughts about this question is, what do you find effective for improving someone's performance? Because it's a real challenge. I think that for education, training in general, it's always the biggest question is like, how do we actually improve someone's performance? There's a lot of research, and some of which we're going to get into a little bit here, but it really is really kind of the gold the gold nugget that we're all looking for in training is like, how do we actually improve someone's performance? Not how do I brain dump something into their brain so that they can recite it for a quiz, but how do I get someone to actually change their behavior, improve the way that they do something, right? And basically the argument I've come to, and kind of the distilled challenge I've kind of given to my team, and I think everyone else in the industry, is that truthfully, the best way to improve someone's performance is one-on-one training with an expert. And that makes sense. And that's actually backed up by some research. I don't know if anyone in here is a big learning theory geek, but if you've ever heard of Bloom's taxonomy, it's a very commonly it's usually taught in like introduction to just like even some training, like adult learning theory kind of courses. Bloom, who did that research on Bloom's theory, if you're familiar with that pyramid where it's like, you have at the bottom understanding and up top you have the harder synthesis and analysis. Basically that, what level of learning are we at? That same Bloom who did that research also did some research around what was effective to improve, to actually move the needle on what people learn. And he came up with in this research analysis of something that they called the 2 sigma problem. Sigma, because the sigma is the little Greek symbol that's used for standard deviation. And basically, the real takeaway here is that one-on-one tutoring, and I know this is like maybe the image might be a little small on your screen, but that green little loop right there is the effect of one-on-one tutoring. And the blue one that's lower and slower and down the chart is conventional classroom, where you would be like group instruction. And basically this is just showing their actual performance on exams after they went through these different types of instruction. And the biggest difference is that one-on-one tutoring is 2 standard deviations better. The students that basically got one-on-one tutoring were within that very, very top of of the class that went through just conventional classroom group instruction. And I think the reason that is intuitive. I do think that most of us understand that it's like, oh yeah, that would be a more effective way to learn something instead of sitting in a classroom with 30 other people working through a PowerPoint presentation. It would obviously be a lot better if I could sit down with that expert trainer or instructor and they could walk me through it, give me feedback, and do all those things. So I think it's somewhat intuitive, but sometimes gets lost when we actually think about training. Just the fact that one-on-one instruction is far more effective than doing group instruction, intuitively and through the research. Another question is like, well, why don't we just do one-on-ones for all of our training then? Well, it's probably somewhat intuitive. I think most people would understand that the problem with always doing that is it's costly. We don't have the people, the resources to always be doing one-on-one training, even though we know it's more effective. We don't always have the ability to just do one-on-one. And there are a lot of fancy tools out there that try to fix it, but I really don't think that anyone's solved this problem. And actually, Bloom, in the research, he defined this problem of trying to recreate the effectiveness of one-on-one tutoring in a group, a classroom setting. And no one's really solved it in the, I think, 40 years since this problem was discovered and defined in some research. It's kind of incredible that you can have a really defined problem that an entire industry of people can't solve for 40 plus years in a really satisfying way. So I do ask, and if anyone wanted to type their answers in chat, but just the question of like, why isn't group instruction very effective? I have my own answers, and there are a lot of reasons why group instruction is not as effective as one-on-one instruction. Um, there just really are a lot. There's quite a bit of difference when you're getting into group instruction. And oh yeah, it's usually not personalized enough. Yes, I think it's is it Dana? That's a really good one. Yes, it's not personalized enough. I think people get nervous and don't want to be wrong or embarrassed. Yes, absolutely. That is a real challenge. I think in there's a real concept called, and there's quite a bit of educational research that goes into how effective this is, but it's called, the term is called productive failure, and it's something that my team, as we create simulations, we really try to recreate, because we're trying to think of how can we get people to fail in a productive way that helps them learn. And I don't know if you've ever been around, like like if you're actually learning a new language. I've always found that people who aren't that afraid of sounding silly are the fastest learners, as far like when they're learning a new language, because there's a lot of, you're always, I mean, for feedback when you're speaking a new language, it's always you're working with other people. And when you're afraid of what other people might think when you say something that's not perfect, it really can affect, how quickly you're able to learn. You're not able to get that quick instant feedback. And just in a general classroom setting, people are just afraid to even ask a question. Whereas when you're in that one-on-one scenario, why not ask just a question? Yeah, being open to it. It really is just kind of accepting that you're going to have some failures along the way. I think that is a much easier thing to do in a one-on-one situation. And if you just think back to like just the way that civilization has worked, we had, traditionally we had trades people. If you go back, I don't know, I have a couple of brothers who are electricians, and electricians still have like a pretty traditional like trades route, that you're a journeyman, you're an apprentice, you're a journeyman, you like work up through the ranks, and they have like very defined roles as you move through in ways that people are trained. But traditional, like, blacksmiths and like feudal times, like there was a very like, it was, this is how you're going to be trained, and it was one-on-one, and it was, taking people by the hands, and it was through experience. It was very hands-on. No one was pulling up PowerPoint slides to instruct you on how to, wield this, like to make a sword as a blacksmith. It was hands-on, it was physical, and it was one-on-one tutoring and immediate feedback. All of those things, yeah, really do add up to group instruction not being as effective, not because of any of the people involved, not because of the trainer, but just the context. We've moved. When you go out of one-on-one, you kind of have to, you immediately lose, like Dana said, that personalization. So I have a few of my own. This is my list. We've kind of just went over that. This one, little to no personalization or adaptation. There's a defined curriculum. There's a defined process and training that we're going to go through, and we're going to hit every single item. It doesn't matter if you already know it. It doesn't matter if you need extra time on it because you don't have context. It's really just, we're going to fly through this at a pace that we just said, this makes sense for everyone. I can tell you, having done a lot of just learner analysis before building curriculums, often it is like, to me, it's kind of it ends up being a really sad, kind of useless process, because you always end up finding, when you're going to do like audience analysis before you do like build training, that it's like, well, we have some of everyone. It's kind of like often people bring up the generation thing, generational divides, and how are we going to train to these different groups? The problem is that often what you're finding is like, well, we have some across all these generations. So you want to like cater a classroom, group training, but then you find, oh, we have people from every generation, of every gender, of every background, and pretty quickly you kind of have to, figure out how to just generalize it enough to hit all of those audiences, which you do lose some in that. It doesn't become personalized. It's not really addressing the needs of individuals. So it is one of those things where it's coming up, and this is I think an exciting place to really explore, is personalization in group instruction. The next item this is, again, just my little list. It's not comprehensive, but the context of the task in group classroom training usually isn't included. And what I mean by the context of a task is all the things that go around it. Even if you're isolating it, even if you're doing some kind of practice, which often isn't getting done in a classroom, it's just, knowledge dump. It's just it can be death by PowerPoint. But when the context of a task isn't included, what you're really doing is you're relying really heavily on this concept in learning theory called transfer. And simply that is that you're going to take something out of one context, some knowledge, and you're just going to use it or apply it, or it's even going to affect your behavior in another context. And the reality is that the research shows over and over again is that transfer often doesn't happen. Is that you think that when you're teaching someone a concept, something really conceptual or a theory, and then you tell them, okay, well, go use this in in this other context in your job, that transfer just often doesn't happen at all. That context just gets lost. There's research that I think has been replicated a few different times that students who study in the exact same chair, desk, classroom that they're going to take the test in do better on those tests. The exact same studying, the exact same amount of time to study and all of that, controlling for everything else, just having this person study in the exact same spot that they're going to take the test makes them perform better on that test. So the real takeaway from that research, and I think what people kind of intuitively know, is that our brains are very contextual. That where the place, the setting, the lamp on the desk, the painting on the wall, everything it's all contextual. Our brains don't work in a way of just like, our brains aren't PowerPoint presentations. They're not neatly little defined things. They're webs of neurons that have what machine learning people call reference frames. Basically, that they connect all these different ideas. And when we're trying to search our brains for those memories, we pull up those contextual clues, those things that were around when that memory was created. So context really does matter. And when we learn in one context and then try to do the thing in another, it can really limit how effective we can be with that training. The next one that I think kind of went along with what Ricardo said is that asking questions is awkward. I really think that it's like, well, I have done quite a few instructor academies. At the IAED, we do these, I feel like twice a year instructor academies to train new instructors that teach EMD certification courses. And in those courses, I always make the point that to new instructors that don't ask, is everyone following along? Don't those little kind of like just small little questions that I think I get it that instructors are like, well, I want to see if everyone's got it. Does that make sense? I think a lot of instructors ask that too. If you're expecting that to be your feedback on whether or not something makes sense, you're going to have to get a little deeper than that. I would ask like pointed questions as like, okay, so, what did we just cover? Does something, a specific, so what is the 2 sigma problem, in this presentation? Like asking something more specific to get back some real feedback of like, oh, they get this. And you're also indicating to them, the learners, that, oh, this is what they're expecting me to know. And that, because sometimes it can feel like, well, you have a million different details that you're covering. What's important? It's nice to give them like some type of just quick, informal assessment of like, did you understand this concept? As opposed to, does that make sense? Because everyone will nod their heads. I've never had, or rarely, anyone ever say when someone says, does that make sense? And be like, nope, it doesn't. I don't understand. Time out. Most people will just nod their heads and go along with the crowd. Another reason that group instruction isn't very effective is that there's little direct feedback, right? it's so great when you're in a one-on-one situation that you can offer up like really direct feedback and immediate feedback. The other nice thing, and this can also come across when you're actually doing role playing or simulations or real work, is that there's naturally occurring what I call naturally occurring feedback, as opposed to that's right, that's wrong, good job, try again. That kind of feedback isn't as helpful as, oh, I see the natural effects of doing something. I just always think of the example of a child, like putting your hand on something hot. I can create a bullet list of items on a PowerPoint slide and sit you down in a classroom and tell you that the stove is hot. Nothing will teach you that better than putting your hand on it. So that kind of naturally occurring feedback in the world, that just like when I do something, this happens, is so much more effective than just someone saying something to you, right? It's just so much more effective to see the consequences of like, when I do this, this thing happens. That will definitely stick in your memory. And then my final, reason for why group instruction doesn't tend to be very effective is that assessments are based on knowledge, not performance. And this is very, very common, that it's really hard to determine if someone, in a structured way, when you have an entire group of, a dozen people, to really assess them on their ability to perform, as opposed to just, do they know this, right? We can give a quiz, you can ask a question, and you can get some feedback, or you can give them a big old exam, and you can get some feedback about what they theoretically know, but we shouldn't mistake that for what they can actually do. I think it can go both ways. It can go to where someone performs really well on a test, but in the actual real world of doing the tasks, doesn't do them well at all. And then I also think it can cut the other way, is that someone can do badly on a test, but intuitively do the tasks really well. So I think our assessments can be really limited when they're limited to multiple choice questions. Then we're just kind of in the world of theoretical and knowledge. And like, again, that transfer, okay, you have some knowledge, but that doesn't necessarily translate into performance. So those are some general reasons why I think that data shows that one-on-one instruction is just so much more effective. So here's a few strategies and some technology that's coming down, and I think it's pretty interesting. One is called, this is a general training industry term called adaptive learning. I don't know, I always have a bad sense of like, because I'm so into the training industry stuff, I'm like, am I the weird person who understands this, or is this becoming more of a common terminology? But adaptive learning, and I've kind of broken down these couple technologies into their ideal, and then I think what often is actually happening right now. So the ideal of adaptive learning is that technology can personalize the learning experience and assessments to that individual, right? Based on exactly, what they're currently doing, their current performance. It's exciting, the idea that technology could help us do that, right? That what a one-on-one trainer can do now and do well, it's exciting, this idea that technology could help us do that as well, that technology can figure out, okay, this is where this individual's performance is, this is the next step, the thing that they need. Oh, they already understand this contextually. They're able to do this thing. Even better than understanding is they're already able to do this. What they aren't able is to do this and just skip over things and customize and adapt the learning to the individual. That's the ideal. I do think that a lot of the products that I've seen out in the industry at this point still are really a learning management system, which, if you're not familiar with the learning management system, it's a way to track learners, the training that individual learners have taken. Like I said, it's traditionally more used just for that compliance side of things, but it can be a more powerful tool, and some are getting some really great features. But I still think at this point that a lot of them are, what they're calling adaptive learning. A lot of what's been calling adaptive learning is just, it's more like a recommendation algorithm. right? I put on here more like Netflix and less like HAL 9000. It is more just like, hey, you took this course. Maybe this other course that has a similar tag or topic might be interesting to you. And to me, that's not really getting at what a one-on-one trainer would do, right? It's not just like, hey, you took this thing, you were interested in this, so maybe you're interested in that. That's not really adaptive learning, right? It's not really based on their ability. It's just based on, you know, their history of trainings that they took. So I would just be kind of, I think that this stuff is coming more and more. I think adaptive learning is going to be really exciting, and there are some cool companies creating some cool products. And I think this will become more and more a part of how digital learning happens, right? This stuff is already happening. Adaptive learning has been happening inside of with one-on-one trainers forever, right? It's been happening for a long, long time. But I think the technology it's getting there. It's an interest. I think it's one of the really more promising aspects of the future of the training industry. I think it's one of the more exciting things coming down the pipe. But like I said, I would just be careful, and like really, if you're talking to a vendor or considering a product, to really get into the details of like, when you say adaptive learning, what do you mean? Like, how does it work? I would say this in general, and I'm going to talk a little more about AI in a little bit and machine learning. But people, it's incredibly frustrating to me that people are using the term AI as if that's just sold. Yep, that's AI just means that it's double plus good. Like I don't care. It's like, tell me what it does. Like I don't need to know if it's AI or not. I just need to know, what does it do? How does it do it? Like I don't need to know the details of the application, but how does it do that? Like, what does it do? Like, what's the effect? Ideally, what's some data that, that demonstrates that this is effective, that it's worked for others? I would just be, get into the details of it. Don't be afraid. Never let some sales folk or some website just kind of gloss over the details and just be like, well, it's really cool. It's modern. Everyone's using it. Get into the details of these things. Like, well, how does it do that? Does it really sound effective? My question right now is really, does it really get close to that like one-on-one tutoring like experience, that one-on-one mentor experience? Does it get there, or does it really not? So I think that's just some things to watch out for adaptive learning. But there is some real excitement to it. The other technology, I don't know, structure trend that I've been seeing is definitely a big blow up in simulations. And I think it's really exciting. The nice thing about this is that we're getting back to the hands-on, as quickly as possible, especially in the 911 training context. It's like, well, we'd rather not just stick someone on the phones their first day. But if you have simulations, you can realistically do that. You can kind of put them in that hot seat of trying to, figure out and get some of that natural feedback, right? I always think, well, in the academy, I can try to go, we can build curriculum and try to explain to people why we believe that, having protocols and some standardized processes are a really good thing. But the best way to actually make that point is just to go through the process of not having that. It really is. I think some of the most effective stuff is just to listen to calls back when it was just, hey, you call and we haul. Just listening to the calls in that era is, I think, the most effective training tool, because you just see the consequences. You see the consequences of, like, a sister, her brother drowned in the pool and she pulled him out, but they're not going to give CPR instructions because they don't have access to them. So they're just like, well, the help's on its way. And the girl's just, sitting there in silence while her brother dies because they don't have instructions for CPR. Like, that kind of experience, just listening to that story, it's such, you just see that feedback is just natural. And that's why I think is the best way to train people. That's one reason I love simulations, is like it's contextual, especially when we're doing simulations of 911 calls. We have a story, we have a caller, there's the complaint of what's happening. I think it's just naturally engrossing, but it also just is such a great training tool. But I think that is the ideal of simulation. I do think that not every simulation lives up to its ideal. A lot of them, I think, can be what I call an approximation of the work, which is great. We definitely need an approximation. But sometimes these simulations, and I've seen some that feel like they miss the mark quite a bit. And I kind of have put it to my team of like, sometimes the simulations can go from immersive to distracting, right? Like if the audio is really bad and awkward, if something is broken, if it doesn't work like the real work, or if the scenario doesn't feel true to life, some of those things, and then when they add up and you check all those little boxes, sometimes it can come to the point where it's like, well, I'm really just more struggling with the tool than I am really getting immersed in the scenario and the work and the tasks that are involved in that work. And then if that's true, if it's more distracting than it is immersive, and if it's only an approximation of the work, again, back to the whole concept of transfer. Transfer is really critical. And like I said, research about just people studying in the same classroom, the same seat that they're going to take a test, helps them improve on that test. So context really matters. So when we're doing simulations, one of the questions I'm always thinking about is like, does this really feel like the actual work that you're doing, right? If it doesn't, and every step you get further away from that of like, well, it's close in this way, but not this way and that way, the further away you get from it being, a replication of the actual work that the people are doing that we're training them on, the further you get away from that, the more you're relying on that transfer, the more you're hoping that, it's kind of like, to me, just like, throwing a hand of confetti over the fence. It's just like, I hope some of this makes it to the other side and someone can pick it up. But it really is, you don't want to be relying on transfer. You want to be getting in and trying to do the real work. And that's what simulations can do, like ideally. But these are just a couple of things I think to look out for when you're looking at simulation tools, because there's a few out there, and there are going to be more. I basically told my, the broader training team at the academy prior to this, I was like, I think simulation is going to become, I think it's going to swallow this in. I think it's going to become a huge, huge part of the 911 training industry. And I'll talk next couple slides. I'll kind of explain a little bit more why I think that. But it's simultaneously exciting, but I think it's also just like adaptive learning. Just be on the lookout, get into the details, say, I want hands-on, let me play with this and think about these things. Like, does it really replicate the work well? Is it really effective at getting that, at that like one-on-one learning experience? So I do want to talk a little bit about AI and machine learning, even though if you're like me, I'm really tired of hearing the phrase, AI. I'm kind of tired of it. But anyways, I've been playing with it. Here's a really disturbing image. I don't know if you've been looking at this image that I have up on this slide. But if you only glance at it, maybe you give it a closer look. And I don't know if you'll start to be just like horrified by the image itself. This image was generated by, I was using Stable Diffusion. It's a modern AI platform. I basically, many keyboards. It's really funny. So my team and I we were playing around with some of these AI image generators that like basically been trained on, like, my assumption is they basically go through and just run them through all of Google images, and then they give them all these associations, and then they can create things based on a text prompt. So to get this image, I literally just typed in 911 dispatcher, and this is what I got back. but I did a lot of them. And I can tell you one funny thing, Ricardo, that was really funny, because the one thing that the AI model has learned about dispatchers is that there's a lot of monitors and there's a lot of keyboards. And so it just throws them everywhere. This isn't even the worst one. The other ones I had were just like so many keyboards and screens. Like we had one that just basically every little like nook and cranny of the image was just like full with a screen, like just a monitor, a display. It's kind of funny. And then it also likes to often put like 6 fingers on people, which is a little disturbing. This one doesn't really have that issue. But if you actually look at these keyboards, they're like gobbledygook. It's interesting. But anyways, I only just put that on here because I do think there are some really interesting things coming through with, I think I would more lean towards the term machine learning than AI. Basically, there's these machine learning models that are being fed basically the entire internet is what they're doing. And that's been controversial about, well, you're taking a bunch of, someone based on some photographs that real people took at some point. And it's like kind of compile them all together into this concept of what a 911 dispatcher is. But the one thing I'd like to also show with this image is it demonstrates the example of the limitations of it. It is usually good for like things where 70% is good enough, right? I mean, this image isn't going to hurt anyone, but if you actually give it all more than just a glance, you start to realize that, wow, this has some real issues. Like, I don't even know what's going on with their head and their ear, and I don't even, there's something wrong with their eye. These screens are really, there's some interesting stuff going on here. Keyboards are taking over the world. Yeah, it's interesting, but it's also not good for any scenario in which accuracy of any kind matters, right? I often think also about self-driving cars, right? I feel like for at least 10 years, there's been like, oh yeah, self-driving cars are almost there. They're just over the horizon. They're almost there. And that's, I think, a good example of just the problems with AI, because in any case where you need it to be, mission critical, it's still quite a ways off. I mean, it's even in cases where you just need it to be solidly accurate, it's a little dicey. But it is interesting. And I do think for simulations, it's one of those things, another simulation, some adaptive learning, there are scenarios in which it can be brought in where it's, simulations aren't necessarily mission critical. Although, like I said before, they're maybe not going to be effective in training if they're more distracting than they are immersive. So here's another example. This one's really recent. I don't know if anyone, if it might be an interesting thing to go do if you haven't yet, but if you just Google Chat-GPT, this was just recently released as a beta by an organization called OpenAI. But basically, it's this conversational bot that you can type in prompts to, and it'll respond to you. And I did this one just this morning. I actually took the screenshot just this morning. This is only released a couple of days ago. But I basically typed in, I have a cut on my arm that is bleeding. What should I do? And then it gave me, if you have a cut that's bleeding, it's important to stop the bleeding as soon as possible. Here are the steps you can take. Apply direct pressure to a wound with clean absorbent cloth or bandage. I mean, it basically gives you it's wordy, it's long, it's obviously pulling from a bunch of Google resources, but it wasn't too bad when I read it. It's really an interesting tool. Conversational AI or machine learning is going to be, and really, I think, an interesting tool, especially when I was talking about before with simulations, or I could see a lot of applications. It's going to be one of those things where I think a lot of companies are going to come and they're going to say they have really great solutions, but there's some real problems with them. That's my expectation. Maybe a lot of this presentation is really about, hey, there's some exciting things coming down the pipe. People are going to be really thrilled about them and want to sell you on them. And I think that you're going to want to be you're going to want to be skeptical, because I think there's going to be a lot of promises. And when you actually get in and use them, it's going to be that 70% problem. Oh yeah, this is like 70% there, but it's not something that we can actually rely on. But for cases in which, things aren't necessarily mission critical, where maybe you are just, hey, you're just whispering in someone's ear, like, hey, based on this conversation, are you thinking about this and this and this? Or in those kind of simulations world, maybe it is. I mean, this chat GPT could be changed. It could be, I mean, I could see a world in which people were feeding 911 calls into a machine learning model and getting back, I don't know what they'd get back, but but it could be interesting, right? I mean, it's a whole crazy world, but it has been fascinating just over the last few months how much crazy AI machine learning stuff has just kind of been boiling up. And it'll go through, like I said, the rest of the training industry, but I do think that people will come and try to apply it to more and more 911 training, which will be interesting and maybe also concerning. I don't know. Like I said, if you're kind of tired of hearing about AI, I'm with you. But it's like I'm like simultaneously fascinated, but also simultaneously kind of exhausted by it. But I thought it was an interesting thing to bring up in the context of all this other training stuff, because I do think more and more these technology tools are going to come to play a role in how we train people. And it's like I said, simultaneously exciting and scary at the same time. So I did want to spend just a little bit of time talking about just the things that my team does in the College of Emergency Dispatch. I'm not here to be a salesman. I just think that we try to do good stuff, especially in the last year or so. We've started a couple of new initiatives, I guess you could call them. Currently, we're working on a series of lessons called the Practice Series. And the real crux of the Practice Series is that they're really packed with practice simulations. They're not the crazy be all end all of what simulation will ever look like. But I do think they do a pretty good job of getting you in and practicing using ProQA, the IAED protocols. It gets you in and actually practicing these things in a real contextual way. Basically, there's at the beginning of every lesson, first thing you jump into a simulation. It's like, let's practice doing this thing. Somewhat setting the learners up for some productive failure. Like I said, that's somewhat our goal, is that you have the opportunity to fail. Like I always say, I can't remember where I got this from, but the time to learn self-defense isn't when you're being jumped in an alleyway, right? The first time to take an active assailant call hopefully won't be an actual call. So I do think we're trying to get in there and actually do some worthwhile things, but it's an ongoing thing. Our hope is to eventually have a lesson on every protocol for each discipline. We are doing medical, fire, and police. We've kind of just been moving through, occasionally prioritizing some other protocols, but mostly we've been going like 1, 2, 3, and then occasionally doing one. We're having one for 25 because there's been some updates to that protocol. But and then we also do a lot of illustrated stories that I think are really great. We have a pretty talented illustrator in our team, and we kind of try to bring every protocol to life through a story, which I think has also been pretty effective. And again, at the very top of the chat, I put a link in there. It's just a simple web page that has this presentation, but it also has links to a practice series lesson of each discipline. I put one in for one medical, one fire, and one police of some recent practice series lessons that you can just click and start going into. It's not being tracked, for credit or anything, but you can just go and open them up right there without a college subscription. And they are those full courses, and you can go in and just play with them, and see what you think. If you're interested at all, you can contact, I think I put it on that page of sales@prioritydispatch.net if you're interested in a college subscription. We also have another series that we just kind of started up we're calling the Science of Dispatch. And they're really just lessons that get to the fundamentals of why complaints are handled the way that they are. Not getting into anything specific to the IAED protocols. It's just, hey, why do we in the 911 industry handle these type of calls this way? What's the background? What are people, for medical topics, like why are people experiencing these types of conditions? Need this kind of, need these instructions, need this kind of response. We are doing them as to be protocol agnostic, which is really been fun for us. They're really short and they're really meant to be like animated and engaging to just try to get you into the topic and teach just a few, core concepts. Just like the core concept, if you're looking at like abdominal pain, just the core concept of, someone might be screaming and the pain might be really bad, but probably they're not about to die, even though it might sound like the pain that they're experiencing makes them feel like they're about to die. They're probably not going to die unless it's unless it's a ectopic pregnancy, like just critical kind of concepts like that, at a high level that doesn't like I said, that is protocol agnostic. And there's an example of that. We did a lesson about exposure, the science of exposure, in that webpage that I linked up at the top. Training, I think it's training-trends.netlify.app. So if you go there, there's links there. I'll leave those up for the next few weeks, just so that people can get in if you want to get in and click around and explore them. They're available there, as well as the presentation. And then I really just had some, selected on my presentation. I wanted to leave a little time for questions. Ricardo actually asked, I saw that Ricardo asked a question about in the Q&A. Ricardo asked, what are your thoughts on gaming as a learning tool? For example, the game 911 Operator. I don't know how good you all are at 911 Operator. I think I remember the first time I played 911 Operator a couple of years ago. I was blown away. I think it was really cool. There's some, I guess I would say, I think there's some real great parts about it. And then it's specific to 911 Operator, but we kind of had our own idea and we started playing around with creating something a little more similar that was maybe had some different goals. I do think the one challenge I have with 911 Operator, even though I find it fascinating, is I don't know, it's kind of like there's always the sensationalized kind of side of 911. I think it plays a little bit heavy to that side, to be honest, that game in particular. But I don't know if any of you have played, like, I don't know, just like Sim City. I love like sim games. I think the reason that those kind of sim games are so great, I think, is that they just teach you about systems, right? And that is a really great way to get naturally occurring feedback, is by having a real simulated system, right? SimCity teaches you some really great things about managing a city, right? First, utilities are super important. People will, and then also you need emergency services, or people are going to die. I don't know or there's a more modern game called City Skylines. It's a city builder. And if you're playing that game and you're not taking care of people, people will complain about everything that you do, right? If you raise taxes, everyone gets angry. If you destroy like a library, everyone gets upset. Or if you build a road through their neighborhood, or you put a landfill near their house, like, it's really interesting because you start to see, for every decision, everything you do, there is a consequence, right? And that's really nice. And that totally happens in Dispatch. So I think games can be really effective. We've kind of built pieces of it. My team has been toying around with building a game that kind of demonstrates some of the reasons why I think protocols are good, but not just protocols, but having codes and basically why prioritized dispatch matters. Because in theory, if you don't really understand the inner workings of emergency services, it feels like, well, you just send a vehicle screaming to every emergency every time someone calls 911. The problem is that you're not really thinking about, there's limited resources. oh, you have emergency vehicle accidents. Like those sort of things don't really come to you when you're just abstractly thinking about it. But when you're in a game, you start to see those systems. And it's like, oh, if I do this thing, there's a consequence to this thing, right? If I send someone screaming lights and siren and they get in an accident, I don't have that vehicle anymore. The person at the scene, I mean, the person who actually called might take longer to get to them. And those kind of things you kind of start to see why systems are the way that they are. So I think games can be really great if you can get to that kind of level. The thing I would call out, though, Ricardo, is I don't necessarily love gamification. I'm going to be honest, and I might get shot down for this, but I don't love just trying to bring, just the kind of just like, you get points or badges or something, just always going for this pursuit of making training engaging, especially when you go to the point where it's like the engagement becomes the thing and the learning becomes kind of the second tier, kind of off to the side. Did we learn anything? Oh, well, that's interesting. That's incidental. What we really wanted to do was have fun. I think that typically the things that you're doing, I think the things that people do in this industry are interesting naturally, right? You do have to train people on some boring stuff. I don't know if you're like working in manufacturing, maybe there's some really boring stuff to train people on. But I think typically the stuff that we train on is just naturally engaging and interesting. I don't think you always have to fluff it up with gamification. I think actually doing something that's a little more like true game is actually a lot more interesting, where you're getting into the systems and the stories and bringing it all to life, as opposed to just trying to figure out triggers and hooks. And I don't know, like I mentioned earlier, I was a teacher for a little while. I got certified to teach before I went to the training industry. And I remember when I was a student teacher, my mentor teacher would just keep absolutely massive bags of like Fruity Tooties or whatever. And then she would just huck them at kids whenever they got the right answer. And it did get kids out of their seats ready to answer questions, right? But I don't know that it really got them learning all that much. And it really didn't. I mean, I don't know if their parents would love the fact that they were just getting pelted with sugar all day, but it was also just, I don't think you kind of lost the message of what are we actually focused on here. So I guess I would say I love games. I don't love gamification. Yeah. Any other questions? Try to look back at the chat. But like I said, I may just repeat one more time. Like at the very top of the chat, I pasted in, maybe I'll paste it again at the bottom, but I pasted in a link. If you click on that link, that'll go to a page where this presentation is available. You can download it. The PDF is available up on there. You can also view it there. And I have links to example courses from the College of Emergency Dispatch, some practice series lessons from the 3 disciplines, and a science of dispatch lesson. And awesome. Like I said, I'll leave those up for a few weeks. And if you just want to go, you can just go in and jump right in and experience them. I could tell you a bunch about them, but I think it's just better to let you get hands on.
Awesome. Thank you very much. That was excellent. And everything that you were saying was really hitting in here. The reason I asked about the game too is because my kids are getting older, and my second kid, my younger son, who's 18 now, he's learning a lot more about all the stuff that I've done and continue to do. And out of nowhere, he says, "So, Dad, I started playing this game called 911 Operator." He goes, "Have you ever heard of it?" I was like, "Yeah, I've heard of it. It's been out for a little while. I think it came out in 2017 or something like that." And I said, "How is it?" And he goes, "Well," he goes, "one of the calls that they had me doing was like I'm talking to a suicidal person." And he goes, "I had to sit there afterwards and just kind of chill by myself for a moment after I took this." And I said, "Wow." I said, "I didn't think that it was like that in depth, that you were doing stuff like that." He goes, "Yeah, I think I might take a break from that for a while. I don't know how you did it for all those years." And I was like, "Well, yeah. It's pretty interesting how, but there's, like you were saying, there's so many different ways to learn and stuff. And it's interesting. It's definitely interesting. It's going to be something."
Yeah, I guess one of my points is like, I think that there are a lot of interesting things coming, and
Mhm.
just like more broadly in the training industry. But people are going to find some ways to start bringing those over to 911 in particular. And it's going to be interesting. There's a lot of exciting things, and there's also some things I'd be a little more cautious about. I think just more than ever, it's really going to take some critical thinking and really like processing from training supervisors and directors on like what makes sense. But it's gonna be interesting.
It is definitely the era of the headset. There's a lot of good stuff that's going on, and I love it. And thank you so much for being here, and for the IAD being a gold sponsor, of course, but also for your session. I appreciate it more than you know. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
And for everyone who is here, please make sure to go to the top of the comments. And actually, I might send you an email to see if I can get that link as well and put it in our Discord for all the attendees that are going there, and then sharing it out and stuff as well,
Great.
for more people to be able to get that information, especially for those that are going to be on replay. So if you're watching in this on replay, again, make sure to scroll to the top and check out that link and all the information there and everything else the IAD is doing. And then we have another session that's going to be going on. We've got 3 different silver sponsors that are going to be going up. So make sure to check those out as well. And we will see you all in the next one.